Today's guest is Robert White. He's trained 1.4 million people across 4 continents, founded 2 leadership development companies that reshaped how humans learn, and also lived over 20 years between Japan, Hong Kong, and mainland China. Then he walked away from organizational scale to mentor individual lone eagles. But here's what separates him from the other personal development industry people. He doesn't sell transformation, he engineers it. For 50 years, he's been asking, how do you systemize the unseeable? Today, we're unpacking the frameworks behind scaling human change, the paradox of going smaller after going massive, and why heart centered leadership might be the most underpriced advantage in today's market. Robert, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be with you, Leo. Great to be with your audience.
So tell us, what's been the most significant lesson that you've gotten in the past 12 months?
It's been a continuation of something that started over 10 years ago. And so the story about that is that I wrote a book called Living an Extraordinary Life. And I sent, like you would or anybody would, I was really nervous when I wrote it. I'm a severe introvert. I knew in writing the book I was going public, that I would have to speak or I would have a warehouse full of books. So I knew I had to get out there, and my beginning to that was to send out all these books to people that I respected in our industry. People like Ken Blanchard, the one-minute manager, author, and the head of or the creator of situational leadership. Jimmy Colano founded Career Track, the biggest seller of one-day seminars in the world, and built it from Boulder, Colorado, actually. And people like that. And I was so nervous, and it was really heartwarming because they liked the book. And they said nice things about it. And they also bought copies for their friends and for their families and for their colleagues. And so it was great. And that praise seemed within me to last for about 18 seconds because the next thing they would say is some version of, I love the book, but I was disappointed in one thing. So, of course, I'm going to say, what is it you were disappointed about? And they would say, the book is not about you. So that was the start of a conversation that now has lasted many years and kind of got accelerated in the last year because the book is about our graduates, that 1.4 million people and what happened for them in our trainings, how they interacted. But these are people that are reasonably successful or even very successful coming into the program. So what is it they got? What is it that they dealt with in terms of maybe things from their past or the way things about how they're showing up currently or about the future that they want to create? And that's what the book's about. I mean, if it was about me, I think my family, some of my family, and my friends might buy a copy, but it wouldn't have become a bestseller in multiple languages. What I didn't share at that time, which would require a therapist and a couch to explain, a long period of examination of me, is that there is one chapter about me. It doesn't say that in the book, but it's really about me. And the book, it's in a section of the book that talks about our belief system. These mostly unconscious, but also conscious beliefs that we have about work, about family, about money, about marriage, about shopping, whatever. We have these beliefs. We don't stop and think things fully through. And most of our behaviors, we're on automatic pilot. It's like our programming, to use the computer metaphor. So what the little subchapter is titled is The World's Most Disempowering Belief. I am not enough. I'm not enough. In executive coaching, you find this with some very successful people who feel that they didn't earn their last promotion or their role or their life. It was all an accident. I'm really not the person everybody thinks I am. I'm weaker instead of stronger. I'm hiding a bunch of stuff. Our American president, Bill Clinton, was famous for compartmentalizing. He could compartmentalize, ignore certain areas of his life, just kind of put it aside. And so I had done that. I had become quite successful. I mean, at the time this journey started around the book and acknowledging that I did write that chapter, I'm Not Enough, about me,
Mm,
And I started exploring where that came from in my childhood and some of the experiences. And one of the things it doesn't say in the book, but this is in our trainings and might be of value to your listeners, is that whatever your belief is, even the unconscious ones, whatever it is, you're going to go looking for evidence that you're right about it. That it's my belief, I'm going to defend it. And again, even the unconscious ones, people do that with those. So I was busy accumulating evidence that I am not enough. At
mm,
the time, I was living in a 14,500 square foot home on 76 acres just outside of Aspen, Colorado. I was skiing 60 to 80 days a year and traveling with the late John Denver for 6 months, co-presenting a program. Had my own jet and a bunch of staff members, and everything was perfect. A wife and a family that I loved, and like all of my dreams come true. And I'm waking up most mornings thinking, God is not finished with me.
mm,
There's something that I'm not dealing with, I'm not doing. And so that started that journey. First of all, with people just saying the book was not about you and realizing, yeah, it is about me, most of it indirectly, but directly that I am not enough. So a combination of good friends, business associates, former trainers that had worked for me and where I had a relationship of trust in terms of their knowledge about the human condition, some therapy, some failure, had a large part to do. And what that all led to in the last year, and that's a long answer to your question,
mm,
is I'm enough.
mm,
I'm still undisciplined sometimes. I still struggle with my weight. I've been amazingly good at getting married and
mm,
amazingly bad at staying married, so, but I'm enough.
mm,
God has gifted me with some talent in certain
mm.
areas, and other areas, no. I'm an average person in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So, but I'm enough. I don't have to struggle with that question.
Right. Yeah. I think that's one of those core questions and beliefs that people sort of learn, unlearn, relearn again throughout their lives, right? I think a lot of people, especially the high achievers, they always want to achieve more and they seem to sometimes they lose sight of what's important, right? They focus on things that don't matter. Maybe it's vanity metrics, like how many books did I sell? How many followers do I have on social media? As opposed to like who they are, who's looking back at them when they look at the mirrors. That is indeed an important lesson. So I want to continue, Roberts. Tell me about the first business. So what were you teaching? How did you build it up to? I mean, over 1 million people back in the 70s, 80s. That's a lot.
Well, look, at 27 years old was a turning point in my life. I had three heart attacks, one at 19, one at 21, one at 23, and had an supposedly incurable heart ailment where I had daily chest pain. And I used to lie about it. The male ego doesn't allow you to admit that you're weak, right? I had been married and divorced. I felt horribly guilty about it. And I didn't share that with anyone. But I knew, I had done some wrong things and felt really bad about it and carried that with me like daily, maybe hourly. And then finally, my little business was failing. And a friend of mine in a similar business went out to California. I was living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at the time. And he went out to California, the land of fruits and nuts at that time, that all the crazy things were happening, including the human potential movement. And he went to the kind of the grandfather, I later learned, of the human potential movement in terms for the average person, a training called Mind Dynamics. He came back and was raving about this experience and saying I should go. And I had a zillion reasons why I didn't want to go. And the more I learned about it, the less I wanted to go, actually. That's true. So for 6 months, I resisted. And two things happened. First of all, I watched his life change. He had been struggling with marriage, was headed for divorce. And I saw, I knew his wife. I was close to this guy, and I saw a marriage heal. And I kind of resist that term, but I mean, it was like it got better in every possible way. And then I saw his business, similar to mine, take off, and mine was still struggling. And finally, this guy had something I didn't know existed, which is adult onset acne. The pimples you get when you're 14 or something, and it's the end of your life.
Interesting.
Well, that condition, that skin condition can occur in adulthood. And that had happened to him, and he was in a sales oriented business, it bothered him a lot. And he'd had all kinds of medical things, uh, cortisone injections into his face and things like that. He blew up like a basketball. His head looked like a basketball at one point. Oh, and he had a abrasion deal where they ground his face. He looked like, those monkeys in the zoo you see with the red butt. That's what his face looked like.
Yeah.
So, along the way, as a friend, I'm compassionate, and I care about that. I saw him struggle with that,
Mm.
and in the 6 months, his face cleared up. So that's the first thing that happened. I saw everything that was important in his life get better while I'm saying, "No, no, no." And he's saying, "This training really helped me," and I'm saying, "No, no, no." And the other thing is that he convinced Mind Dynamics to bring the training to Milwaukee, and
Mm.
he helped put, about 30 people together, including me. And so I went to this thing with arms crossed, legs crossed, maybe eyes crossed, really negative, really cynical. Oh, and while pretending that everything was great in my life, ego out to, I'm looking out the window here at Mount Evans. It was about as big as Mount Evans in some ways. And then my life changed for the better. It was not instant. It took a couple of years, maybe 3 years, to put into action what I learned about myself in that training. There was not one word about success or about money or about business. It was all about me and how I was in the way of accomplishing what I wanted to accomplish. It's kind of like that Bill Clinton story. I had compartmentalized all of that and said that I was just a victim that of my ex-wife, of the system, of the economy, the sponsoring company that was providing my products. You know, I didn't own it all, and I had a real strength that I acknowledge that I have, which is I'm a good critical thinker. I didn't know that at
Mm.
that time, at 27,
Mhm.
but I was externalizing that and being critical of the people that were most important to me,
Mm.
particularly anybody where I judged myself as less successful than them. I
Mhm.
used criticism to tear them down to my level. And
Yeah.
again, these are things you learn over time. I was
Mhm.
unconscious about it until I went through that training.
Yeah.
In the year following the training, my income tripled.
Hmm.
And in the next year after that, it went up 10 times. I started making more money per month than I'd ever made in a year. And that led me to encouraging other people to do that training. I sold that business. I became a contract sales trainer in New York City. I went from working with 31 people to working with 850. So
Mhm.
I could no longer interview as my primary way of running the business. I had to do these weekend seminars. I brought in the Mind Dynamics trainer from New York, and we encouraged people to do that training. I was being paid on a percentage of the increase, and my increase was significant.
Mhm.
So it wasn't like a noble gift,
Mhm.
Maybe it was at some level, but I also made a lot of money because I encouraged people to go do that same seminar that had helped me so much.
Mm.
So that company found out about me. They called me. I didn't know the founder's name. I knew nothing about the company. I just knew the training worked and I knew the local instructor. So
Yeah.
he flew me to California, and 10 days later, I was president of Mind Dynamics. So for 4 years, I learned the training business. I learned from Alexander Everett, the founder and chairman, that everything depended on our service, our results with our clients, and that had to be first and second and third, and then maybe fourth. It was other things.
Mhm.
And I learned that from his example, and we had a lot of success. His partner in that business died, unfortunately, very young in an airplane crash. And Alexander had a pattern in his life of doing new things. And he had been shepherding Mind Dynamics for 7 years at that point. I mean, I ran the business of the business and he ran the training, the content, the training of trainers, all of those, that side of things. And he quit and he went on to something new once again and sold his shares in the business to the estate of his late partner because taxes become a big issue when you die without a will. I
Mm.
learned all this, and he didn't like that. He didn't like all of that pressure we were under from a probate judge. And I ended up working for a probate judge. And so I quit. And that led to founding LifeSpring. I then sold that business to my staff, went to Asia, created ARC International. And that's the answer to your question about 1,400,000.
Yeah, very cool. So it seems like you just kind of happened to come across this course, and then you went in really hard, and like you're able to see a ton of success in a short period of time. What were the kind of catalysts to that? Was it a combination of like learning new skills, or is it certain habits that you built?
I can tell you a lot of stories of things I did wrong. What I did right was learn from reality. When something worked, we did more of it. When it didn't work, we tossed it aside.
Yeah.
And working with my executive clients and their teams, what I found is that when they are super successful, that's when they mirror that behavior. If it works, do more of it. If it doesn't work, get rid of it quickly. If that's true about hiring and firing, that's true about, the popular term now is a pivot, shifting what you're doing or the target audience and shifting your pricing or shifting even your product or service. We did that without knowing it. I did it because, growing up poor and a lot of abuse, I learned very quickly to do what works and assuming it's moral and legal, do what works, and if it doesn't work, change. Try something new. And, I spent 8 months sleeping on a friend's sofa for the first 8 months of my business in Japan. I did whatever I had to do. I sent my
Yeah.
family back to the US. And we were, one of my friends, he has this expression, we were poor but poverty stricken. But, it's a typical startup. These clients that I work with quite often, they have incredible origin stories it isn't smooth for anybody. You make mistakes, your business plan turns out to be a fantasy and it's key people that you were counting on don't come through. All those things happen. The question is, what do you do with that? You keep trying to do the same thing or do you take on something new?
So when you were starting your business in Japan, I mean, walk us through that. So you moved to Japan not knowing how the systems work, or did you sort of have a connection there? Did you have local partners? And like, I mean, sending your family home, that's no easy decision either.
No, it was a tough year. We lived apart for a full year. But look, when I was with Mind Dynamics, the first 2 years there was kind of straightening out the U.S. business. Alexander was a fantastic thought leader. He wasn't a great businessman, and so it was kind of a mess. So I spent a lot of fix it, stuff. The second 2 years, I responded to opportunities that we had abroad because these graduates of Mind Dynamics, and there were, over 1 million of them, some of them lived abroad or moved abroad or took a job abroad, and they wanted to bring the training to help them in their new setting. So I set up 7 foreign subsidiaries of Mind Dynamics. For a young guy traveling the world was fantastic. I learned so much and had these incredible experiences. And I had the backing of Alexander, this very wise older man as my mentor, as my example of being a good man, in addition to being a brilliant man. I don't have any pretense I'm not as brilliant as Alexander Everett, but I saw how hard he worked, how the standards that he had, and the culture that he built and that I was shepherding by that time. The one country I said no to was Japan. I went there for a week. First of all, it was the most expensive uh, place to do business at that time because space is at a premium in Japan. What is our second biggest need after salary? Space to do
Mm,
training,
right.
uh, especially trainings that require the use of music and lighting and all these gimmicks that we
Hmm.
use to get people out of their brain and into their heart.
Right.
So, and then the language is backwards. And the mind dynamics training was more dependent on language than the work that I do today. So, translation, I could see, was an absolute issue
Mm,
because the language is kind of backwards from Romanic languages, English, French, German, all of those. And finally, we were busy, we were stressed. So I said, no. Those graduates in Japan that sourced my visit there were in touch with me every month for 2.5 years. I mean, that's that Japanese culture, that
mhm,
you don't give up, right?
mhm.
And I said, no, 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 and no, both during the Mind Dynamics days and then in doing this startup last spring. would have been foolish for me to divert attention. And then I sold LifeSpring and I put every cent that I had had into it, Leo. It was self funded.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I had some money, and so I funded myself. And I sold the business for nothing down and forever to pay. That's an old expression. And the
Yeah.
other part of that expression is they took longer than forever to pay. So
Yeah.
they did pay
Wow.
me eventually, but I sold it to the staff and went off to Japan. But remember, I had these graduates in Japan
Mm.
and they hired me on a contract basis. The way they got me to come was after my saying no all of those years, is number one, I was unemployed with no money and a family and a mortgage, all of those things. And they changed their offer. They said, come for 90 days, set up a program, and you can leave, and we'll pay you for 1 year. I
Pretty
got on the
good.
airplane. That 3 months turned into the first time
Hmm.
12 years in Japan and and it included sleeping on the sofa and not having any money and being late on payroll and things like that. We got very
Yeah.
broke very fast, but
Yeah.
it worked out well. But that was Arc International was 22 years of my life,
Yeah.
and by the time when we got to our zenith, we had 4,100 new students a month in worldwide. But we were in
Yeah.
7 countries and 15 training centers and 240 full-time staff and other 60 pretty much full-time contract trainers. So it was a major for a training company. It was huge.
Yeah. So two questions from that. Like when you're starting a business, things are tight all the time. I mean, it's very hard to have a business that just spits out cash enough to fuel your growth and everything. So I mean, it makes sense. When the finances were tight, first off, how did you manage that? And how did you keep your team engaged? If payroll's late even. And second, like how did you grow that fast?
Well, some of it was unconscious, but it worked. I don't know where it came from in some ways. It certainly came from the example that I saw from Alexander Everett about paying attention to culture, paying attention to having a game that you could play and win, and attracting partners into that game, partners in spirit, not in ownership, but in spirit. There were a lot of things like that. And we sold purely on a referral basis. The same way I came into the training business, that's how we sold. People telling people about a good experience and encouraging them to come. Now, we guide that experience better than I knew how to do in Mind Dynamics. We got better at that. We found some things that worked better. It all was on referrals, no advertising, no brochures, no, just people telling people about the work and encouraging them to come. So it starts slow, it's one to one to one, but then pretty soon you find people that already have a network. So that instead of, I mean, we kept numbers for 17 of those 22 years. Our graduates who went through the 3 programs that we offered were then encouraged to bring other people, and we monitored their results. Our average over time is that those graduates recruited 3.3 students in a 100-day period. Now, if you run the numbers on that, that's a growth cycle
Yeah.
because the replacement is 1 to 3. And now, not every person was in that program, but it still works. But what I learned is that there are people with these networks, lawyers and CPAs, business owners, teachers, actors. We had people that recruited 10 and 15 and 20 and even 50 people. And so that's how, over time, that ball kept rolling and growing in size and speed.
Hmm.
I mean, plenty of problems along the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
We could spend hours talking about that. It would require maybe recently I'm not drinking at all, but I used to enjoy a glass of wine now and then.
Mm.
Maybe over a glass of wine, we could tell those stories for
There you go.
hours
Yeah.
and what we learned from them. We did these graduate events where they would bring their friends and then we do a presentation. A memorable one was we did one in the early days when we had no money and no momentum where nobody came. Not one graduate, not one guest. We had worked all week to get ready for it. We had the chairs set up and the flip charts set up and everything's ready. And the time for the training came and nobody showed up. Not one
Wow.
person. And
How
then
come?
you go to victims. The first thing you do is you have a staff meeting and you tell your victim story. We're teaching personal responsibility, but we're telling our victim story. And then somebody starts laughing, and I don't remember who it was on the staff. and reminding me and everyone, well, okay, we've told our victim story. How were we accountable for that? What could we have done better? And, it's just one story, Leo, but it's
Mm,
multiplied 1,000 times on how we handled breakdown and break through. In terms of how to manage something like that, we had a cult. We believed in what we were doing. We believed in the results we were helping people create. We believed in the mindset shift that happened for most of our graduates and what they did out in the world and came back to us with the most inspiring, heartwarming stories about their lives. And that's kind of the fuel that kept
mm,
us going even in the tough times.
makes
We
sense.
had major betrayals, we had major legal problems, major financial problems, but we were committed, you know.
Mm,
And I have this actually gift that I'm going to offer to your listeners called the 8 principles. And what happened is that when we started getting some momentum, we're doing over 1,000 students a month. We had a money back guarantee. Absolute. If you don't get the value you expected from this experience, we'll give you your money back. And the numbers over those 17 years is 97.8% did not ask for their money back. 2.2% did. And for a variety of reasons, including maybe not getting the value they expected. But that's a pretty good number.
mm,
The learning from that's one set of learning. Most people get value. But what I started to notice is that there were people who went out of our training and did the most amazing things. Honda got into the F1 business, auto racing, those super expensive, super fast, open fender, or what do they call those cars? The really fast cars.
yeah.
Honda got into the business and they had a Japanese driver, of course. And for several years, and they spent millions and millions of dollars. That's a very expensive sport to sponsor a car
Yeah.
and pay the driver and, all of those people, the pit crew, all that.
Right.
And they never placed in the top 10.
Hmm.
And so a guy goes through our training. I don't meet him. I don't know him. I don't know anything about him. He's just another number to me. I'm running a company. I'm
Mm-hmm.
running a personal growth company and a consulting company and a sales training company. And I'm busy and I don't meet these. It was actually somewhat of a mistake. I don't meet many graduates. So I didn't
Mm,
meet this guy. I knew nothing about him. I didn't know he was a graduate. And he goes out and wins a Formula One race about a year later after our training. Now, do you know how big that is in Japan to
no.
have the first Japanese driver win an F1 race?
Yeah.
It was huge. You see his picture on all these big billboards selling whiskey or tires or something. He's getting all these endorsements. He's getting big speaker fees to come to corporate meetings and talk about his success. So we had people like that. So we surveyed them, over 1,000
Mhm.
of them. And what we learned is they came into the seminar with a certain set of principles, of standards, of values. So they approached our training the same way they were approaching all of their life.
Hmm.
And I got curious. I wanted to know, what are those principles? So that became the 8 principles. Originally 5 and then expanded to 8. And not one of them is a surprise. You and every one of your listeners know all 8 of them. But what happens is that over time, we kind of forget about them or we put them in a place where we don't act on them
Hmm.
always. There are things like being really clear about what you want, about telling the truth, like real truth, not half truth,
Hmm.
about fully expressing yourself, about playing win win instead of win lose in your family and your business and your community. And the eighth one is commitment. And,
Hmm.
I've said in public settings and public speaking that if you violate all 7 of the first 7, but you get commitment, your success rate's going to go way up, and we lived that in our company. We did what we said we were going to do. And we started opening every seminar, both personal growth and corporate, with an explanation of those 8 principles and having people rate them on all 8, from 1 to 10.
Hmm.
10 being you could teach that subject, and 0 or 1 being you're going to be a loser.
Yeah.
But somewhere in between were many people. And then we would ask them to pick 1 or 2 or 3 where their rating was less than ideal and where they knew that if they improved in that area, their life would change for the better. So,
Hmm.
anyway, I've got a 28-page essay on that subject. If they go to our website, extraordinarypeople.com, and sign up for my e-zine, my weekly email that can be read in 1 minute or less, by the way. That's the rule for that one. They'll get this 28 pager. It's shareable. It's good for you to sit down and do the little 8 questions on where you are and what you want to work on. Changing a lot of things at once is not very good.
Mm.
I mean, that sounds non-academic, but it really
Yeah.
doesn't work. The academics have proven that. But you choose 1 or 2 things to work on, you can do that. And so it helps you focus on that, and it's
Yeah.
free. So,
Yep. Yep. And we'll make sure it's linked as well. And yeah, I think as far as change goes, it's hard as entrepreneurs to want to be patient, right? They want to fix everything all at once. So
yes,
it's power to focus your energy on one or maybe two things at most, because I mean, in science, right, like you want to isolate the variables that you're testing for. So how do
yes.
you know how effective one approach is if you don't properly isolate it? So I agree, that's very well said. So when it comes to doing business internationally, so you with arc, right, I mean, you were in Asia for 20 plus years. I mean, what was that like, just doing business in kind of a place that is far away from home? I mean, back then, the culture was very different. The world wasn't as connected as it is now. Do you rely on finding good kind of boots on ground partners that are familiar with the systems that can help you get around and make business smoother? Or how did you build your team too?
Well, I think I'm often asked for a tip. There's a great one-liner that everybody wants to go to heaven, nobody wants to die. But everybody wants the answer to be something really easy and simple and clear, and that just never works, frankly. But the question gets asked of me, you got to have an answer, and my answer always is the same, which is increase your awareness. That ARC company name, ARC, is an acronym for awareness, responsibility, and communication, which is what we were teaching. But awareness is so important, and that's what's important if you go abroad, is to wake up to a different culture, to how things are done differently and seen differently here. And Japan is radically different than China. The Philippines are radically different than the other two. Korea is radically different. Even though there are commonalities in Asia, but there's radical differences. Same if you come back to the US, in one company compared to another company, there's radical differences. Uh, I mean, Ford is radically different than General Motors, not just in their cars, but in their culture, right? Great famous story. At one point, one of our graduates came to work for us as a vice president, and he had been with UPS, the big delivery company, right? The Brown company, all their gimmicks about Brown. So he told me about a guy that was pitching them for some business, consulting business, who sent the proposal to UPS via FedEx. That's a cultural mistake.
Yeah.
I asked him, did they open the envelope? And he said, yeah, we did. But that guy was out
Yeah.
from that moment. So having an awareness of the culture and a few key areas, but also to represent who you are authentically and not to let go of that. So an example is that one of the things in our both personal and corporate training is about dealing with blame, shame, regret, and guilt, letting go of stuff from your past that maybe you've compartmentalized, but it's affecting how you hire, how you fire, how you treat your family. It affects everything when you're carrying around that kind of stuff. And many of
Mm.
us have that stuff. Well, the big one in America is guilt. It's somewhat a product of a Judeo Christian
Mm.
background to our
Mhm.
country. And, especially the Catholics and the Jews, they seem to have a monopoly on guilt. So dealing,
Yeah.
feeling it, confessing it, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Not in Japan. They
Mm.
don't feel guilty. They feel shame.
Mm.
Very different. Guilt is how you feel about something you did. Shame is how you showed up to someone else, to a person, to a culture, to your company, whatever. It's external, not totally, but mostly external. So we changed that part of our training when we figured that out. And again, what works, keep it. What doesn't work, look at something new. So we
Yeah.
dug into why people were not responding to our section on guilt
Mm.
and
Yeah.
shifted it to shame. And I learned a whole lot about shame
Mm.
and how it's different than for most Americans, we are shameless.
Mm.
We could probably do with a little more of it. That's one
Yeah.
of my realizations. But
Yeah.
there were things like that. There were things in business practice.
Mm.
I joined the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan. I did it for selfish reasons to
Mm,
network and find
mhm.
clients. But I learned so much from those meetings, from running a committee and then being on the board of directors, a board of governors, I think that was what they called it, because I got to hang out with people that were models for what I wanted to create. They were running bigger games than me.
Mm,
I had never had any experience with big corporations. So I
yeah.
learned from them a lot. But that's an awareness thing. Are you open to learning? And I had informal mentors and coaches and then formal ones. I now have three coaches. And, people reach out to me and say, well, I'm thinking about hiring a coach. But, what should I do? Because I no longer do life coaching. I only work with executives and their teams.
Mm,
So they'll call me and say, well, how do I select a coach? And my answer is always the same, which is first of all, have they been there and done that in their lives? Do they have actual life experience? But then secondly, do they have a coach?
mm,
A coach without a coach is not one I would ever hire, you
mm,
know, because you've got to do what you're promoting to others. And you got to keep learning about yourself. And based on your experience, I think you become a much better coach and mentor. So I don't know why I did that in those days, but I did. But part of it was I was not enough.
mm,
It goes back to that same thing.
yeah.
I mean, I've been to more than 50 seminars outside of our work. Some of those for me, and knowing I need to continue to plug myself into the growth experiences, and some because I'm in that industry, I want to know what's going on. I've only walked out of three, so I've learned something that was useful in most of them,
Mhm,
over 90% of them. I think that going abroad is like that. And I would share one quick story, which is when I was heading the seminars committee for the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan, we'd get approached by people who were coming to Japan and wanted to sell something to corporate members. So there was a young couple that they were graduates of the Stanford's MBA program. The People on the West Coast mostly will say that's the best, and people from Harvard say they're the best. Okay, Stanford's pretty high ranked, and they met at Stanford and got married. And what a commonality they had is they both grew up as children of expatriates.
mm,
The guy, I know his father and mother lived in Saudi Arabia. They worked for Aramco, the big oil company,
mhm,
so that's where he grew up, was in Saudi Arabia. I don't remember his wife's, but she lived abroad also. And that was the commonality. And they spent their childhood abroad. And to get out of Stanford's MBA program, you have to have a business plan. You do or you don't follow the business plan, but you've got to have one. And they did a business plan for originally three films, at that time, 16 millimeter films, to be sold to business people who were going abroad or to their companies that were sending them abroad. So the three films, number one was for people making a short visit. And by the way, that film was about awareness. I mean, they were not graduates of our program, but they knew that if you're going into a foreign culture, you better wake up. That things are different here. The second one was for people that go there for a long stay. In Japan, it was common for foreigners, Americans or Europeans, to come for a minimum of 2 years, maybe a maximum of five, but more often 2 to 3 years. And so you bring your family, and it's different for you uh, to be there for a long time than a week or two. So the second film dealt with that, and the third one was for the family because families really have to adjust. I heard a political program recently where they were talking about our current vice president and if he would run for president and would that mean for his very young family. And it's different if you're in some kind of high political office on your family. And if you go abroad, it has a certain impact on your family. So those were the three films.
mm,
But by the time they got to us and did their presentation and sold a lot of films, by the way, by the time they got there, a fourth film came out. And the fourth film, I always remember the title, Welcome Home Stranger. And
mhm,
I experienced that when I came back to the US in 1986 because I learned I was a stranger to my own country.
hmm,
I had lived
yeah,
in Asia and specifically in Japan for a
mm,
long time.
mhm,
And it was a shock to find out
yeah,
that, first of all, my fantasy of America was just that, a
yeah, yep,
fantasy. And then
right,
secondly, it really was a different culture. I mean,
mm,
in Japan, if you went to a shop, let's say you went to a liquor store for a certain bottle of wine and they didn't have the bottle of wine, they would ask you to wait while they ran to a competitor to get that bottle of wine for you. And then they would sell it to you for what they paid for it. that would be Japan. And I remember coming back to the US and I'm in the airport. I need change. I didn't have a telephone card or that didn't exist at that time. I needed to make a phone call and all I had was $100 bills.
Mm,
Guess what it was like to go to the little kiosk, the one that sells newspapers and gum and stuff like that, and ask them to change a $100 bill? I
yeah.
got heard the rudest expressions I had ever heard in
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
life. And that went on for about a year.
Yeah.
So what home stranger? And it
Right.
illustrates the difference in cultures.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. No, thank you for sharing all of your wisdom. I mean, it seems like it's a really well-rounded life of many ups and downs and lefts and rights. So how can viewers kind of reach out to you? How can we connect with you? Who are you looking to connect with?
Look, I'm interested in small, growing, or medium-sized business people that have a team, and those are the people I identify with. Where I have the same, I've been through the same problems they're in. I'm got through the solutions. I can help, and I can bring their team with them in terms of commitment. But the best way to reach me is the website extraordinarypeople.com. You can sign up for the free stuff. There's a lot of it on leadership and on personal growth. You can find my book there or on Books By or Amazon, and let's talk, you know. So relationship is everything. And if I can help, I like doing that a lot.
Thank you so much, Robert.
My